August 1945. The summer heat in Texas didn't just linger in the air. It pressed down like a heavy blanket, baking the dirt roads and turning the sky into a blinding sheet of white fire. A military transport truck ground to a halt outside a barbed wire fence in the middle of nowhere. Inside sat 6 German women, dressed in faded olive uniforms, eyes wide with fatigue and dread. They had been told many things: that Americans were ruthless, that if captured, they'd be executed, tortured, or worse, that no pity would be shown to followers of Adolf Hitler, especially not to women who had served his war machine. Even if they hadn't fought, they wore the uniform. They had been part of the war, and now they were captives of it. 22-year-old Ilse Kohler sat rigid on the rough wooden bench of the truck bed. She had grown up staring at photos of starving German children, victims, so she was taught, of the Treaty of Versailles. She had marched in school parades beneath the red banners of the swastika. Her teachers had warned that Americans were beasts, loud, greedy, dangerous. She expected to be stripped, searched, maybe even struck. But as she stepped down from the truck and touched American soil, the first thing she saw wasn't a rifle aimed at her. It was a young American soldier, hardly older than she was, holding out a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. The soda hissed as he popped the cap. He offered it with a smile. "Welcome to Texas, ma'am," he said. In that moment, under the merciless Texas sun, everything she thought she knew about her enemies began to unravel. She had arrived expecting a prison. She had no idea she was about to find a new life. Before we can understand how a German woman in a Nazi uniform could one day fall in love with a Texas cowboy, we need to see how she ended up in Texas at all. By the end of World War II, the United States was detaining more than 450,000 German prisoners of war across nearly 500 camps scattered throughout the American South, Midwest, and West. Texas alone held more than $78,000. Most were men, soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, or sailors from the Kriegsmarine. But a small and often forgotten group, fewer than 1,000, were women. They weren't frontline combatants, but they were still classified as military personnel or auxiliaries. Many had served in support roles: nurses, radio clerks, secretaries, or civilian volunteers attached to the army. Some had joined willingly, believing they were serving their fatherland. These women were captured in various places, some in France, some in Italy, others in Germany itself as Allied forces advanced. Once taken, they were classified as enemy prisoners under the Geneva Conventions and shipped, often without knowing where, across the Atlantic to America. The journey was long, grueling, and filled with fear. But what awaited them at the other end terrified them most. From childhood, they had been fed a steady stream of Nazi propaganda: posters, newsreels, radio shows, and school lessons that painted Americans as savage, immoral, and godless. According to Nazi ideology, Americans weren't a real nation, just a corrupted mix of Jews, Africans, and immigrants, uncivilized, uncontrolled, dangerous. For women like Ilse, the thought of falling into American hands was horrifying. It wasn't just the fear of being imprisoned. It was the terror of being degraded, humiliated, or assaulted. These weren't irrational fears. They had been drilled into them since childhood. Yet what they found in Texas was nothing like what they'd imagined. The POW camps in America, especially those in Texas, were vastly different from the brutal camps of Europe or the Pacific. Under the Geneva Conventions, the United States was legally bound to treat prisoners humanely. But beyond legality, there was also culture. American officers, particularly in rural Texas, often encouraged interaction between locals and prisoners. It saved money. Prisoners could work on farms and in canneries, easing wartime labor shortages. So, like the men, the women were often allowed to leave the camps during the day for agricultural work. Sometimes they were guarded. Other times, They were simply trusted to return. To the Germans, this was astonishing. Not just the freedom, but the trust. Inside the camps, they had real beds, access to libraries, Red Cross parcels with chocolate and cigarettes. There were even musical instruments, theater shows, and English classes. The guards didn't beat them. They addressed them with respect. They followed procedure. One former prisoner would later say, "I had never eaten so well in my life as I did in an American prison camp." For women like Ilse, the emotional shock was overwhelming. The people they'd been taught to hate, the supposed monsters, were feeding them, treating them with dignity, and offering more respect than their own superiors ever had. But if life inside the camp was astonishing, what happened outside would be something none of them, or their commanders back home, could ever have imagined. This wasn't mercy. It was policy. The United States military had strict guidelines based on the Geneva Convention for the treatment of prisoners. Prisoners were to be housed humanely, provided adequate food and medical care, and allowed to write letters home. Inspections were carried out regularly. Abuse was not tolerated. But for Elsa and other German women raised in the shadow of Nazi doctrine, none of this made sense. How could the Americans, the country she'd been taught to fear, treat her like a person? The truth is, Nazi propaganda had worked too well. By the time these young women reached adulthood, their entire emotional framework had been built around fear. Fear of the enemy, fear of dishonor, fear of what would happen if Germany lost the war. Now that the war was lost and they were prisoners, they braced themselves for the nightmare. And yet the nightmare never came. Instead came food, clean sheets, privacy, soap, books, Coca-Cola. For Elsa, every kind gesture only deepened her confusion. It wasn't just that the Americans were kind. It was that their kindness didn't demand submission. There were no political speeches, no lectures about democracy. No one tried to convert her to anything. They simply treated her decently and expected her to behave the same. One day in June, Elsa was sent out on work detail to a cotton farm 20 miles outside the camp. It was her first time outside the barbed wire since arriving in America. She rode in the back of a pickup truck with 4 other prisoners and a single-ear armed guard, who was mostly there to make sure no one got lost. Not that anyone was planning to run. There was nowhere to go. When they arrived, a tall, sunburned Texan named Thomas Walker was waiting. He was 25, a Navy veteran recently discharged. His father's farm had lost all its laborers to the draft, and now they were hiring prisoners. Thomas had never met a German woman before, let alone one who looked like she stepped out of a propaganda film. Elsa was tall, pale, with blonde hair pinned neatly back, and sharp blue eyes that barely met his. Neither trusted the other, neither spoke the other's language. But as the sun rose and the day wore on, something shifted. Thomas brought water. Elsa helped sort cotton. He showed her how to wear gloves to keep from getting blisters. She said, "Thank you," in English. "Haseiden" in German. No one watching would have called it romantic. Not yet, but it washerman. And for 2 people who had grown up on opposite sides of the planet, told to hate each other, that was more radical than anyone could have imagined. First encounters and forbidden bonds. For the next several weeks, Elsa returned to the Walker farm almost every day. The work was hard under the Texas sun. Everything was harder. But the atmosphere was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peaceful. There were no bomb sirens, no barked orders, no propaganda posters, just long rows of cotton, a rusted old radio playing country music from the barn, and the quiet rhythm of labor. At first, she kept to herself, but Thomas kept finding ways to break the silence. He started by learning how to pronounce her name correctly. Ilzu, not Ilk. Then he brought her a pair of leather gloves. One day, he offered her a handkerchief when her hands blistered. Another day, a lemon drop candy from his shirt pocket. None of it was required. None of it was romantic. Not yet. But for a young woman who had known only rigid hierarchy and suspicion, his small acts of casual kindness felt revolutionary. Elsa began to laugh again, softly at first, unsure if it was allowed. She began to teach him German words. He called her Fräulein, mispronounced at first, but always with a grin. She taught him how to say Guten Morgen, had taught her how to say howdy. Neither of them got it quite right. One afternoon, during a break, Thomas handed her a notebook and a pencil. "For English," he said, gesturing between them. So they started writing notes to each other. Short sentences at first. "The sky is blue. You are funny. I like music. Do you miss your home?" It was safer than speaking. In writing, there was time to think, to guess, to hope the other would understand. Elsa wrote that she had 2 brothers. One had died in Russia. The other was missing. She didn't know if her parents were still alive. Thomas wrote that he'd lost his older brother in Normandy, that his mother cried every Sunday in church, that he wasn't sure why he had come home when so many hadn't. They didn't talk about Hitler or Roosevelt or politics. They didn't talk about who was right and who was wrong. They talked about rain, about music, about horses, about how good cold watermelon tasted after a long day of work. That, of course, didn't go unnoticed. Prisoners weren't supposed to fraternize with civilians. There were strict rules, especially when it came to romantic contact. And while there was no public display between Thomas and Elsa, some locals began to notice the way they looked at each other, the way they lingered when saying goodbye. One evening, the camp commandant called Ilsa into his office. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply reminded her, "You are still a prisoner of war. You represent Germany. Don't forget who you are." She nodded. But that night, she cried into her pillow. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. Thomas wasn't spared either. A neighbor warned him, "You can't go falling for one of them Nazi girls, son. People will talk." But Thomas wasn't listening. He wasn't in love. Not yet. But he was drawn to her, to the quiet strength behind her formality, to the way she held back her words until they mattered. He didn't care what flag she'd once served. He only knew she wasn't who they said she was. She was kind. She was curious. She was trying. And perhaps she was just as lost as he was. By September, they had developed a rhythm. Thomas would send her a note folded into the corner of a book he lent through a friendly guard. She'd write back with a pressed flower or a short sentence in careful slanted English. Then one day, she didn't come. The truck arrived at the farm without her. Thomas asked the guard casually, pretending not to care. "Her group's been reassigned," the guard said. "New rotation. Different camp next week." That night, Thomas wrote her a letter. Long, awkward, and full of spelling mistakes. He ended it with a single question. "If you leave, would you ever come back?" Elsa received the letter 2 days later. She didn't reply immediately. She read it once, then again, then again. Then she folded it into the lining of her pillow and didn't tell anyone. Something had changed, and they both knew it. Love in enemy territory. When Elsa stepped off the work truck 2 weeks later, back at the Walker farm, she carried nothing in her hands but a letter. She had begged the camp officer to allow her return. Not officially, of course. That would have raised questions, but she'd heard that the Walker family had requested workers again, and she'd made sure her name was on the list. Thomas was waiting by the gate. He didn't smile. Neither did she. Instead, she handed him the letter, folded, sealed, and trembling slightly in her palm. He opened it right there in the dust and heat, his calloused fingers moving slower than usual. It read, "If I come back, it's not because I am allowed. It's because I choose to. You asked if I would ever return. This is my answer." Elsa, that day they worked in silence. But something had shifted. Not flirtation, not imagination, something real. A choice had been made on both sides, but nothing about it was simple. They were still divided by language, by uniform, by war, and by laws. Everything about their bond was unofficial, unspoken, unrecognized, and potentially dangerous. Fraternization between American civilians and German prisoners wasn't just frowned upon. It could lead to disciplinary action, even expulsion or relocation of the prisoner. For Americans, being seen as soft on Nazis in 1945 could end friendships, jobs, and reputations. And yet, bonds like theirs weren't uncommon. Across the United States, dozens of relationships quietly bloomed between German prisoners and locals, often through shared work, music, or education programs. A few were romantic, fewer still lasted, but those that did burned bright in the shadows. Thomas and Elsa found ways to spend time together without drawing suspicion. They would work close during field labor, share lunch breaks behind the barn, and leave notes hidden in hollow fence posts or inside borrowed books. Sometimes when no one was looking, she would hum a melody, an old folk song her grandmother used to sing. Thomas would pretend to guess the tune just to keep her going. One day he gave her a pencil sketch he'd drawn, clumsy but heartfelt, of a cotton field under sunset. In the corner he had written, "For the girl who changed everything I thought I knew." Elsa didn't cry. She folded the paper, tucked it into her blouse, and whispered, "Danke." But even in that quiet joy, fear lingered. The war had ended. Yes, Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. But in many ways, the peace was even more confusing than the war. Ilse didn't know what awaited her back home, if anything. Her hometown had been firebombed. Letters from Europe took months, if they arrived at all. Rumors swirled among the prisoners that Germany was starving, that Soviet troops were brutal in the East, that women like her were being shamed or imprisoned by their own countrymen for surviving the war in Allied hands. The idea of going home after everything no longer felt like a return. It felt like being erased. Thomas could sense this, even if she didn't say it aloud. And so late one October afternoon, he asked the question they'd both been avoiding. "What if you stayed?" Elsa looked at him, her hands dirty, her face flushed from work, and didn't answer right away. "I'm a prisoner," she finally said. "I don't get to choose." But Thomas wasn't asking about rules. He was asking about her heart. The next week, he spoke to a local pastor about what it would take to marry a foreign national. The man shook his head. "Not possible while she's still AP," he said. "Even after you'd need the government's permission, and good luck with that." But Thomas didn't give up. He wrote to his congressman. He wrote to the military. He even asked the Red Cross for advice. Elsa, meanwhile, had quietly applied for transfer to another camp closer to where administrative processing took place for repatriation. She hadn't told Thomas she didn't want to make promises she couldn't keep. Then in December, a notice arrived. All German prisoners would begin mandatory repatriation processing in early 1946. That meant medical checks, documentation, and preparation for deportation. Most would be gone within 3 months. Elsa read the notice alone in her bunk. The words swam in front of her eyes. She had less than 100 days left in America. That night, Thomas met her at the far edge of the Walker property, a spot just outside the range of camp patrols. "I got your drawing," she said softly. "It's in my pillow." He took her hand, careful, gentle, as if afraid to break the moment. "I don't want to lose you," he said. "I don't care where you came from. I just want you here." Elsa didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, "You know what they'll say about you." Thomas nodded. Let them talk. It was the most American thing he could have said. Wars end, and a choice between two worlds. Wars end, and a choice between two worlds. By January of 1946, the war was over. Not just on paper, but in feeling. American soldiers were coming home. Factories were shifting from tanks to toasters. There were parades, weddings, and babies named after generals. But for Ilse Kohler, nothing felt settled. She remained in limbo, neither prisoner nor citizen, not free, but not in chains. Her uniform was gone, replaced by plain work clothes. Her days were filled with labor, English lessons, and waiting. The U.S. government had begun formal repatriation. German PS were being processed, grouped, and shipped back to Europe by the thousands. Men went first, then civilians, then women. Ilsa's turn was coming. She received a notice. Report to Camp Hearn, Texas. Departure within 4 weeks. Destination: Brehaven, Germany. The paper didn't say what would happen after that. It didn't say if her parents were alive. It didn't say if she'd return to a home or to rubble. And it certainly didn't say anything about Thomas. When she told him, his jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. He just nodded slowly and said, "Then we need to make this official." He had done his homework. There was a legal loophole, just barely. In 1945, the U.S. War Brides Act was passed. It allowed foreign women who had married American servicemen during the war to enter the country legally, even if they were former enemy nationals. But Elsa wasn't married, not yet, and Thomas wasn't active duty anymore. Still, there was precedent. A few P-marriages had already occurred. Controversial, rare, but not impossible. Thomas contacted a sympathetic lawyer in Dallas. He made phone calls. He wrote letters. He gathered character witnesses from the town, neighbors who knew Ilsa only as a quiet, hard-working girl, not a Nazi. Meanwhile, Elsa was transferred to Camp Hearn, the final stop before repatriation. The camp was larger, more crowded, more chaotic. Emotions were high. Some prisoners couldn't wait to go home. Others were terrified. There were rumors of arrest, revenge, and hunger in post-war Germany. Elsa received one letter from her hometown. Her mother had died in an air raid. Her father's status was unknown. Her brother, the one who had been missing, had never come home. Her whole world now existed in Texas in a cotton field, in a smile, in a man who still carried her first note in his wallet. Thomas came to visit using a civilian work permit to gain access. They sat together on opposite sides of a chain-link fence. The guard gave them 10 minutes. "Will you marry me?" he asked again, quieter this time. "I don't know if they'll let us," she said. "I don't care. I'll wait. I'll find a way." She looked down, then up. Her voice cracked. "Then yes, yes." The paperwork moved slowly. Approvals were required from military officials, immigration services, and local courts. Each department asked for a reason. Each one demanded proof. In February, her departure date was moved forward. March the 1st, they were running out of time. Then, just days before she was scheduled to leave, a telegram arrived at the camp from the office of the regional Prost Marshal. A marriage license had been approved for Miss Ilsa Kohler and Mr. Thomas Walker, pending in-person registration. It was a narrow window and no guarantee. Elsa was escorted under guard to a courthouse in Waco, Texas. Thomas met her there, dressed in his best shirt and borrowed tie. She wore a plain white dress lent to her by the pastor's daughter. There was no music, no flowers, just a tired judge, 2 witnesses, and a promise whispered in accented English, "I do." That afternoon, Ilsa's status changed, not from prisoner to citizen, but from enemy alien to legal spouse of a U.S. national. It was enough to halt her deportation, pending full immigration review. She didn't return to Germany. She returned to Amarillo. Locals talked. Whispers followed her through town. But Thomas stood by her. So did his family. Over time, the town softened. Some never accepted her. Others came to admire her quiet dignity. She learned to make cornbread. She planted sunflowers behind the barn. She got a job at the local library teaching German to returning veterans who wanted to understand the language of the people they had fought. And when asked where she came from, she always said the same thing. "Germany sent me here, but America made me stay." A wedding, a new life, and the final goodbye to Germany. Elsa and Thomas were married legally, quietly, and without celebration, but to them it was more than enough. In the weeks that followed their courthouse wedding, Ilsa moved into the small farmhouse just outside Amarillo. The house was modest, 2 bedrooms, a front porch with chipped paint, and a back garden still recovering from years of war-era neglect. But to Ilsa, It was a paradise. No barbed wire, no guards, no roll calls, just silence, fields, and Thomas. Neighbors were cautious at first. Some waved politely, others didn't wave at all. One woman, an old widow who had lost a son in Belgium, refused to speak to Elsa for over a year. But Elsa never answered with anger. She baked. She helped where she could. She attended church. She spoke when spoken to. And over time, the hostility faded. Not because people forgot where she came from, but because they learned who she was now. In the spring of 1946, Thomas's mother gave Elsa a wedding gift. Her old veil wrapped in lavender paper, tucked away since her own marriage in 1919. Ilsa wore it for a second ceremony, this time at the local chapel. It wasn't required, but she wanted it. This time, there was music, flowers, and a borrowed dress from a cousin. This time she said her vows in English. She had chosen her new country, but she never fully erased the old one. She wrote letters to cousins, to anyone left back home. She sent care packages when she could. Canned peaches, aspirin, sometimes photographs. But the responses dwindled. Some never arrived. Some were returned unopened. And one day she stopped writing. Ilsa never went back to Germany. No taunts, not for visits, not for funerals, not even after the Berlin Wall fell. When asked, she would simply say that life ended. This one began differently. She and Thomas endured droughts, economic downturns, the Cold War, the dawn of television, and the first steps on the moon. They never had children. A quiet sorrow neither spoke of much. But they had nieces and nephews, a circle, a home. Ilsa became known around the local library as the German woman with the flawless memory. She taught high school students how to pronounce Goethe. She cooked spätzle for the county fair. On Veterans Day, she stood beside her husband in the front row, always together. Yet every so often, usually in autumn, she would sit on the porch with a pencil and a pad. She would draw. Once, a neighbor girl asked what she was sketching. Ilsa replied, "Memories, before they disappear completely." One of those drawings, still kept by a distant cousin, depicted a cotton field at sunset. In the corner, in her neat slanted handwriting, were 4 words, "Everything I once believed." Thomas passed away in 1993. Ilsa followed in 2007. They rest side by side in a small Texas graveyard under a shared headstone that reads, "Together through war and peace." Ilsa's story never appeared in school books. It didn't make the papers. There were no medals, no parades, but it was one of countless others. Quiet, human, nearly forgotten. After World War II, at least 37 recorded marriages took place between German prisoners and American citizens. Some were men who married American women. Others, like Ilsa, were female prisoners who chose to remain in the very country they had been taught to despise. Not out of obligation, but out of love. These stories don't fit neatly into history books. They challenge the narrative. They ask us to face something deeply unsettling, that even among enemies, understanding can bloom, even between strangers, compassion can exist. What the Nazi regime never anticipated, what no propaganda, real or fiery speech could foresee, was that some of its most devoted youth would fall for those they had been trained to hate. And more astonishing still, that those people would love them in return. This wasn't a betrayal of nation. It was the rediscovery of humanity. Ilsa never stopped being German, but she became American in the truest sense, not by birthright, but by belief. She believed in effort, in forgiveness, in the worth of the individual. She believed that people should be measured by their deeds, not their origins. That conviction didn't come from a slogan or a leader. It came from a Texas cotton field and a young man who offered her a bottle of soda instead of a glare. When she died in 2007, the local paper ran a small obituary, Ilsa Walker. German-born, Texas resident, cherished wife, librarian, and friend to all. It didn't mention the war, but her niece remembered one story, the final one Ilse told before she passed. Someone had asked if she ever regretted leaving Germany. Ilse was silent for a long time. Then she said softly, "Germany gave me fear. America gave me hope. I chose hope." Fear. America gave me hope. I chose hope.